The massive Imperial starship emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, its golden hull gleaming under the distant sunlight. On its bridge, Commander Reed stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the blue-green planet displayed on the main screen. His thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Another primitive world to add to our glorious empire," he said to his bridge crew. "Scan for their technology level." The scans came back quickly, showing cities, satellites, and a modest space presence around the third planet. What caught the commander's attention was the unusual energy readings coming from various points around the planet. Before he could order a deeper scan, his communications officer spoke up. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the planet. It's being broadcast on multiple frequencies in over 50 different languages." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Put it through." The screen changed to show a human in a crisp military uniform. The man's face was weathered but dignified, his gray hair and steady gaze suggesting both age and experience. "I am Admiral Marcus of the Human Defense Fleet. On behalf of Earth and all human colonies, I welcome you to our system. We wish to establish peaceful first contact protocols." Reed's smile widened. These humans didn't know their place in the galaxy. The Empire had conquered over 10,000 worlds in its history. This would be no different. "This is Commander Reed of the Galactic Empire's exploration fleet. Your world has been chosen for integration into our empire. Submit to our authority, and the transition will be peaceful. Resist, and we will be forced to demonstrate our power." Admiral Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Commander Reed, I strongly advise against hostile actions. We are willing to establish diplomatic relations as equals, but we will not submit to threats." Reed laughed, the sound echoing across his bridge. "Equals? Your species barely has a presence beyond your own planet. Our empire spans 3 galaxies. We have conquered civilizations you couldn't even dream of. Submit, or face the consequences." There was a pause as Admiral Marcus looked down at something off-screen. When he looked back up, his expression was almost sad. "Commander, we've just detected 12 more of your ships entering our system. If you're planning what I think you are, I have one final message for you." "And what would that be?" Reed asked, amused by the human's persistence. "Run. Run while you still can." The transmission cut off, leaving Reed momentarily stunned by the audacity of the warning. Then he began to laugh again, harder this time. His bridge crew joined in nervously. "Launch the integration fleet," Reed commanded. "Show these humans what happens to those who defy the Empire." The 12 Imperial warships moved into attack formation, their weapons charging. Standard procedure was to destroy a few major cities as a show of force. It had worked countless times before. But as the fleet approached Earth's orbit, something strange happened. Their sensors started giving conflicting readings. The energy signatures they detected earlier began to pulse in an odd pattern. "Sir," his tactical officer called out, voice trembling, "we're detecting thousands of small objects launching from the planet." "Primitive missiles," Reed asked dismissively. "Raise shields." The objects weren't missiles. As they approached, they split apart into smaller units, each one emitting a field that somehow slipped right through the Imperial shields. The first ship to be hit simply ceased functioning, its lights going dark. The second exploded silently in space. The third began firing its weapons randomly, its control systems apparently hijacked. "Impossible," Reed shouted as his own flagship systems began to flicker. "Their technology is too primitive for this." A new transmission came through, showing Admiral Marcus again. This time, the old man's expression was grim. "We warned you, Commander Reed. We've spent centuries preparing for this moment, watching the stars, building our defenses. Your empire isn't the first advanced civilization we've encountered, but it might be the last to make this mistake." As his ship's systems continued to fail around him, Reed realized with growing horror that the humans hadn't been primitive at all. They had been waiting, preparing, and his empire had just walked right into their trap. The last thing Commander Reed saw before his ship lost power was the image of Earth's defense platforms powering up, their energy signatures now clear and terrifying in their implications. The humans hadn't just been ready for a fight. They had been ready for war. The Imperial Palace on Centaurus Prime sparkled under three suns, its crystal spires reaching toward the purple sky. Inside the war room, Fleet Admiral Thompson of the Imperial High Command slammed his fist on the holographic table, making the star map flicker. 13 ships. They disabled 13 of our ships without firing a single energy weapon. His face had turned a deep shade of red. This is unacceptable. The assembled military leaders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Commander Reed's report had arrived hours ago, along with the damaged ships that had managed to limp back to Imperial space. The humans' defense systems had been unlike anything they'd encountered in 10,000 years of conquest. Perhaps, one of the younger generals suggested, we should consider diplomatic. Silence. Thompson roared. The Empire does not negotiate with primitives. We will launch a proper attack. Show these humans what real Imperial power looks like. 3 days later, a fleet of 100 Imperial warships dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter. This time, they were ready. Their shields had been modified based on the data from the first encounter, and their weapons were set to frequencies that should bypass any known defense system. Admiral Marcus watched from the bridge of the Earth Defense Force flagship Deterrent as the Imperial fleet approached. His senior staff had expected this response. Empires, after all, were predictable in their pride. They've modified their shields, his tactical officer reported, and their weapons are cycling through new frequencies. Marcus nodded. Just as we predicted. Deploy the Phase 2 defense grid. Across the solar system, hidden platforms came to life. Unlike the first encounter's relatively simple disruption devices, these were something else entirely. The humans had spent generations preparing layers upon layers of defenses. The Imperial fleet moved forward in perfect formation, their golden hulls forming an arrow pointed at Earth. Fleet Admiral Thompson stood proudly on his bridge, ready to restore the Empire's honor. Launch the first wave, he commanded. Show them what happens when you defy. He never finished his sentence. The space between his fleet and Earth suddenly lit up with thousands of small silvery objects. They looked like mirrors at first, reflecting the light of the distant sun. Sir, his sensor officer called out, those objects, they're bending our weapon fire back at us. Thompson watched in horror as the first volley of Imperial energy weapons hit the mirror-like defense grid. The beams bounced between the reflective surfaces, gaining energy with each reflection, before striking back at his own ships. 3 Imperial cruisers exploded before anyone could react. Impossible, Thompson shouted. Switch to projectile weapons. But the humans had planned for this too. As soon as the Imperial ships launched their physical projectiles, another layer of defense activated. Gravitational fields appeared out of nowhere, catching the projectiles and accelerating them back toward the Imperial fleet at 10 times their original speed. Sir, his communications officer said, voice shaking, we're receiving a transmission from Earth. Admiral Marcus appeared on the main screen, looking as calm as ever. Fleet Admiral Thompson, I presume. I see you've chosen to ignore our warning. Those ships you lost in the first wave. That was us being gentle. Thompson's face contorted with rage. You dare. We dare because we must, Marcus interrupted. Your empire has never faced humans in war before. You don't understand what that means. We've spent our entire history fighting ourselves, perfecting the art of war. When we finally looked to the stars, we didn't see peace. We saw the need to be ready. As if to emphasize his point, another wave of Imperial ships exploded as their own weapons were turned against them. Thompson watched helplessly as his carefully planned attack fell apart. This is your final warning, Marcus said. The next layer of defense isn't designed to disable or destroy. It's designed to make examples. Leave our space, or find out why every other advanced race that discovered us chose to keep their distance. The transmission cut off, leaving Thompson staring at the growing debris field that had once been his mighty fleet. For the first time in his long career, he felt something he'd never expected to feel. Fear of what humans might do next. The Imperial War Council chamber fell silent as the Emperor himself entered. His gold-trimmed robes swept across the marble floor as he took his seat at the head of the table. No emperor had personally attended a war council in over 500 years. 2 defeats, the Emperor said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the room. In all our history, we have never suffered 2 defeats in a row. Explain. Fleet Admiral Thompson stood, his hands shaking slightly. Your Imperial Majesty, the humans, they're different. They have technology we've never seen before. Defenses that shouldn't be possible. And now, the Emperor continued, our border worlds report their colonies are going dark. Communications cut off. Ships disappearing. Tell me, Admiral, what are we facing? Before Thompson could answer, the chamber's main display lit up with an incoming transmission. The Emperor's guards moved to block it, but the signal bypassed all security protocols. Admiral Marcus's face appeared, but this time he wasn't on his ship. He stood in what looked like an underground command center. Greetings, Emperor, Marcus said calmly. I thought it was time we spoke directly. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. You dare hack into our most secure facility. We've been in your systems for centuries, Marcus replied. Watching, learning, preparing. Did you really think Earth was our only world? The chamber erupted in whispers as screens around the room began displaying data. Star maps appeared, showing hundreds of human colonies scattered throughout Imperial space. They had been there all along, hidden beneath Imperial sensors, waiting. Impossible, Thompson shouted. Our surveys would have found them. Your surveys found exactly what we wanted them to find, Marcus said. We learned long ago that the best way to hide wasn't to stay silent, but to control what others could see. Every scan your ships made passed through our filters. Every probe you sent was guided away from our true colonies. The Emperor raised his hand for silence. Why reveal this now? Because it's time you understood what you're really facing, Marcus answered. Operation Scattered Stars is now active. Your empire has never lost a war because you've never fought an enemy who was truly prepared for you. We've had colonies in your space since before you found Earth. We know every weakness in your defenses, every flaw in your strategies. As if to prove his point, the lights in the chamber flickered. Outside, through the crystal walls, they could see Imperial ships in orbit suddenly changing course, their control systems hijacked. That's not possible, one of the council members whispered. Our ships can't be hacked. The systems aren't even connected to outside networks. You still don't understand, Marcus said. We didn't hack them today. We built backdoors into them when they were constructed. Your shipyards have been compromised for decades. Every vessel you've built in the last 50 years has our code buried so deep you'll never find it. The Emperor stood slowly, his face a mask of carefully controlled rage. You think this display of treachery will frighten us? The Empire controls 3 galaxies. We have resources you cannot imagine. No, Marcus replied, his voice growing harder. You have resources we allowed you to keep. As we speak, human forces are activating across your territory. We're not fighting for survival, Emperor. We're not even fighting for victory. We're simply deciding whether to let your empire continue existing. The transmission cut off, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. Moments later, reports began flooding in from across Imperial space. Hidden human fleets were appearing everywhere. Imperial defense systems were shutting down. Supposedly secure facilities were being opened from the inside. The Emperor sank back into his chair, his face pale. For the first time in the Empire's history, they weren't facing an enemy they could simply overwhelm with superior numbers and technology. They were facing an enemy who had outmaneuvered them before the war even began. Humanity hadn't just prepared for war. They had prepared for this specific war, against this specific enemy. and they had been doing it for longer than anyone had imagined possible. Captain Rogers stood on the bridge of the stealth ship Shadow, watching the massive Imperial shipyard through the viewscreen. His vessel, like all human stealth ships, was completely invisible to Imperial sensors. The Empire still hadn't figured out how humans had perfected true stealth technology. All teams in position, his tactical officer reported. The other yards are targeted as well. Rogers nodded. Across Imperial space, 50 other stealth ships were positioned near the Empire's biggest shipyards. This operation would show the Empire exactly what kind of warfare humans excelled at. "Begin broadcast," he ordered. Throughout the shipyard, workers suddenly stopped as their communication systems activated without their input. A message played in perfect Imperial standard. "This is a human advisory. You have 10 minutes to evacuate. We suggest you run." The Imperial commanders in charge of the shipyard laughed at first. Their defense systems showed no enemy ships in range. Their shields were at full power, their weapons were primed, but they had never faced human psychological warfare before. "Sir," Rogers' tactical officer said, "Imperial Command is ordering their workers to stay at their posts, calling our warning a pathetic attempt at intimidation." Rogers checked his countdown timer. 8 minutes left. "Start the music." Through every speaker in the shipyard, an old human battle song began to play. The steady drum beats echoed through the halls, growing louder with each passing minute. The Imperial workers, despite their commander's orders, began to move toward the escape pods. 6 minutes, Rogers announced calmly. "Deploy the nanites." Invisible clouds of microscopic robots, released weeks ago by maintenance droids the humans had reprogrammed, activated throughout the shipyard. They began to eat through specific metals, targeting structural weak points that human spies had identified years before. The Imperial commanders finally noticed something was wrong when their desk computers started melting. 4 minutes, Rogers said. "Activate the sleeper programs." Across the shipyard, robots and computer systems that had been secretly modified by human agents came to life. Doors sealed, emergency systems activated. The shipyard's own defense turrets turned inward. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, "Imperial evacuation has begun." "They're running." Rogers allowed himself a small smile. 2 minutes. Begin power surge. The human agents who had infiltrated the shipyard's maintenance crews years ago had installed tiny devices in the power systems. Now those devices activated, sending surges of energy through the shipyard's power grid. 1 minute. All personnel clear. Confirmed. No life signs remain in the target zones. Rogers took a deep breath. Execute final phase. The nanites, which had been steadily weakening the shipyard structure, received their final commands. In perfect synchronization, they severed key support beams and power conduits. The power surge reached its peak, and throughout Imperial space, 50 shipyards began to tear themselves apart from the inside. The Empire's mighty shipyard, capable of building 100-kilometer-long warships, collapsed in on itself without a single shot being fired. Similar reports came in from across Imperial space. Humanity had just destroyed more than half of the Empire's shipbuilding capability without losing a single soldier. On the Imperial capital, the Emperor watched the reports come in with growing horror. Decades of infiltration. Years of preparation. The humans hadn't just beaten their defenses, they had turned the Empire's own systems against them. How? He demanded of his advisors. How did they do this? Admiral Marcus's face appeared on the emergency channel again. "You still don't understand, do you? While your empire was conquering through brute force, humanity was perfecting the art of invisible warfare. Every worker you hired could have been one of ours. Every computer you built might have had our codes. Every ship you constructed might have been designed to fail at exactly the right moment." The Emperor's hands gripped his throne tightly. "What do you want?" "The same thing we wanted from the start," Marcus replied. "For you to understand that fighting humanity was a mistake. We didn't build weapons to conquer you. We built them to teach you why you should have listened when we warned you to run." The transmission ended, leaving the Emperor to watch as more reports of destruction poured in. The humans hadn't just defeated their military. They had shattered the Empire's belief in its own invincibility. The Imperial Intelligence Director stood before the Emperor and his council, his hands trembling as he held a data tablet. The information his agents had uncovered about humanity's history had shaken him to his core. "Your Majesty," he began, "we've discovered why the humans were so prepared for war. Their entire history, it's unlike anything we've seen before." The Emperor leaned forward on his crystal throne. "Explain." "Most species develop space travel first, then weapons," the director said. "It's the natural order we've seen across 3 galaxies. But humans, they developed weapons first. Their entire history is warfare." The chamber's main screen activated, showing images from Earth's past. Swords, guns, tanks, nuclear weapons. Each image was accompanied by dates that made the Imperial leaders shift uncomfortably in their seats. "They had nuclear weapons before they had computers," the director continued. "They had biological weapons before they had spaceflight. They had cyber warfare capabilities before they had colonies. Everything we thought made us superior. They had developed it all before they ever left their planet." Another screen lit up, showing Admiral Marcus. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood representatives from what appeared to be different human military organizations. "I see you've been doing your homework," Marcus said. "Yes, we developed differently than you expected. Want to know why?" The Emperor's face darkened. "You're in our systems again." "We never left," Marcus replied. "But that's not important right now. What's important is that you understand what you're really facing." "Show them, Director." The Intelligence Director jumped as his tablet activated on its own, displaying new information. This can't be right. According to this, humans have had faster-than-light capability for over 500 years. "Correct," Marcus said. "We didn't announce ourselves to the galaxy when we first achieved spaceflight. Instead, we watched, we learned, we saw how the Empire treated primitive species. So we hid our true capabilities and prepared." The screen showed more images: hidden human shipyards, underground cities, massive defense networks that had been invisible to Imperial scans. "Your empire prides itself on never losing a war," Marcus continued. "But you've never faced a species that spent thousands of years fighting itself, perfecting the art of war before reaching the stars. You've never faced an enemy who had centuries to study you before you even knew they existed. In the Imperial Navy's main base, thousands of soldiers watched their weapons dissolve into dust. Another human technology that had been planted years ago, waiting for this moment. Your soldiers are trained to follow orders," Marcus said. "Ours are trained to think independently, to adapt, to overcome. Your ships are built to overpower enemies. Ours are built to outsmart them." The Emperor stood, his patience wearing thin. "Is this just another demonstration of your power? More psychological warfare?" "No," Marcus replied softly. "This is us trying to help you understand why you should surrender. Your empire has conquered 10,000 worlds, but you've never had to fight for your own survival. We have. Over and over throughout our history." Reports began flooding in from across Imperial space. Human agents, who had been living as Imperial citizens for generations, were revealing themselves. Military bases found their weapons useless. Ships discovered their engines had been secretly modified years ago. "This isn't a war," Marcus continued. "This is us showing you why every other advanced civilization that found us chose to leave us alone. We don't want to destroy your empire. We don't want your worlds. We just want you to understand one simple truth." "And what truth is that?" the Emperor demanded. "That humanity doesn't need to prove its superiority in battle," Marcus answered. "We proved it by living among you for centuries without you ever knowing. Every victory your empire has had in the last 300 years was because we allowed it." The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial leaders in stunned silence. They hadn't just underestimated humanity's military capabilities. They had underestimated humanity's patience, their planning, their willingness to spend generations preparing for a war they hoped would never come. The Empire hadn't just started a war. They had awakened a sleeping giant that had been watching them all along. The Imperial Palace shook as the Emperor activated the emergency protocols. Red lights flashed through the crystal corridors as soldiers rushed to their stations. After 6 days of continuous defeats, he had made his final decision. "Launch the World Breaker fleet," he commanded, his voice echoing through the war room. "All of them." Fleet Admiral Thompson's face went pale. "Your Majesty, the World Breakers. We've never needed to deploy more than one. Using all 50 at once is exactly what we must do," the Emperor cut him off. "These humans have hidden among us, infiltrated us, humiliated us. Now they will learn why we are called an empire." Deep in the forbidden sectors of Imperial space, massive shipyards awakened. The World Breakers were the Empire's ultimate weapons, planet-sized vessels capable of destroying entire solar systems. Each one carried enough firepower to vaporize a sun. In Earth's Defense Command Center, Admiral Marcus watched the Imperial activity with calm eyes. Behind him, massive screens showed the World Breakers emerging from their secret docks. "They're really doing it," his tactical officer said quietly. "They're deploying all of them." Marcus nodded. "Send the signal. It's time to show them our final card." Across the solar system, something incredible began to happen. The planets themselves seemed to shift. Massive sections of Mars, Venus, and Jupiter's moons split apart, revealing what lay beneath. The humans hadn't just built defense platforms. They had hollowed out entire planets and turned them into weapons. The World Breaker fleet arrived in a massive display of power, their enormous ships casting shadows across space. The Emperor's voice broadcast across all frequencies. "Humanity, witness the true might of the Empire. These ships can destroy your entire system. Surrender now or be erased from existence." Admiral Marcus stood up, straightening his uniform. "Open a channel." The Emperor's face appeared on the main screen, confident in his ultimate victory, but Marcus was smiling. "Emperor," he said calmly, "look closer at your World Breakers. Specifically, look at who built them." The Emperor's confidence wavered as new information appeared on his screens. The World Breakers' construction records, their design specifications, their core programming, all of it contained traces of human influence. His greatest weapons had been compromised before they were even built. "Impossible," he whispered. "We told you," Marcus replied. "We've been preparing for centuries. Did you think we'd ignore your super weapons? Look around you, Emperor. Really look." The hollowed-out planets of the solar system began to glow with energy readings that broke every sensor in the Imperial fleet. The humans hadn't just built defenses, they had constructed a weapon system larger than anything the Empire had ever imagined. "Last chance," Marcus said. "Recall your fleet and surrender. We don't want to use this." The Emperor stood from his throne, rage overtaking his fear. "Fire, destroy them all." The World Breakers powered up their main weapons. But as they did, secondary systems that had laid dormant for years activated. Emergency shutdowns triggered. Backup protocols engaged. The mighty ships, pride of the Empire, hung helpless in space. "Now," Marcus said quietly, "watch what real power looks like." The transformed planets aligned, creating an energy web that encompassed the entire solar system. The World Breakers, for all their might, looked tiny in comparison. "Your empire thinks in terms of ships and fleets," Marcus explained. "We thought bigger. Every planet in our system is part of one massive defense network. We didn't build ships to match yours. We built something that made ships obsolete." The Emperor watched in horror as his mighty World Breaker fleet was caught in an energy field that covered billions of kilometers. They weren't just trapped. They were completely at humanity's mercy. "This is what we try to warn you about," Marcus said. "Not our weapons, not our technology, but our way of thinking. You fight wars, Emperor. We end them before they begin. The Empire's last hope, its ultimate weapons, hung powerless in space. They had finally learned why every other civilization that discovered humanity had chosen to stay away. It wasn't fear of human weapons that kept them at bay. It was the knowledge that humans had already won any war before it started. The Imperial Palace's grand throne room had never felt so quiet. The Emperor sat on his crystal throne, looking older than he had just days ago. Before him stood Admiral Marcus, in person for the first time, along with representatives from Earth's United Military Command. "Your empire has stood for 10,000 years," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "We're not here to end that. We're here to change it." The Emperor looked at the human standing before him, not through a screen, not as a hologram, but in the flesh. The boldness of humans never ceased to amaze him. "How long?" the Emperor asked. "How long have you really been watching us?" Marcus smiled slightly. "The first human scout ships reached Imperial space 800 years ago. We saw how you treated other species, how you demanded submission, how you crushed resistance, so we made a different plan." The chamber screens activated, showing a historical timeline that made the Imperial leaders gasp. Human observers had been in their space since before the Empire's modern age. They had shaped Imperial development so subtly that no one had noticed. "Your greatest technologies," Marcus continued, "we guided their development. Your fastest ships. We made sure you found the right design principles. Your strongest weapons. We let you think you had created them alone." "Why?" the Emperor demanded. "If you had such power, why not simply conquer us centuries ago?" "Because that's what you would have done," Marcus replied. "Humans learned long ago that true power isn't about conquest. It's about influence, direction, guidance." Around them, the palace's security systems, which had been quietly under human control for centuries, stood down. Outside, the World Breaker fleet was being escorted back to Imperial space by ships that had emerged from hyperspace gates humans had built ages ago. "Look at your empire now," Marcus said, gesturing to the screens showing various Imperial worlds. "Your people aren't rioting. Your colonies aren't rebelling. Because we made sure your rule, while proud, was never truly cruel. We've been guiding you toward peace for centuries." The Emperor stood slowly from his throne. "You're saying we've been, what? Your experiment?" "No," Marcus shook his head. "Your training." Humanity knew that eventually we would need to reveal ourselves. We wanted to make sure that when we did, the Empire would be ready to accept a new way of thinking. On screens across Imperial space, citizens watched as their Emperor walked down from his throne to stand face to face with the human admiral. It was a moment that would be remembered for generations. "The Treaty of Terra," Marcus said, producing a small data crystal, "isn't about surrender. It's about partnership. Your empire will maintain its territory, its culture, its pride. But now you'll have humanity's open guidance, not our hidden hand." The Emperor took the crystal, studying it carefully. "And if we refuse?" "You won't," Marcus smiled, "because we made sure that when this day came, you would be wise enough to make the right choice. Your people are ready. They have been for years." Throughout Imperial space, humans who had lived among them for generations were revealing their true identities, but they weren't met with anger or fear. Instead, Imperial citizens were learning how these humans had helped build their communities, improve their lives, guide their development. "Your empire never lost a war before meeting us," Marcus said, "because we made sure you never faced an enemy you weren't ready for. Now, you'll never need to fear war again. Because humanity isn't your conqueror. We're your guardians. We always have been." The Emperor looked at the data crystal one last time, then plugged it into his throne system. The Treaty of Terra appeared on screens across 3 galaxies. With a single gesture, he pressed his palm to the authentication panel. "We warned you to run," Marcus said softly. "But what we really meant was, run toward the future, not away from it. Welcome to a new age, Emperor." one where humanity doesn't hide in the shadows, but stands beside you in the light. And so the great galactic empire learned its final lesson. The most powerful force in the universe wasn't weapons or ships or even technology. It was patience, wisdom, and the guidance of a species that had learned to win wars not through destruction, but through understanding.